Our list of program speakers for the remainder of the year has been filled out. Coming up August the 7th will be Nancy Lowe. She's a return. She was here in February, I believe, of this. And she will be having a program that she's entitled Cataloging Digital Family Photos. If you remember that a photo can be worth 1,000 words, first you'll only have to, if you can find them. So she has a program on that. In September, we have a visitor from the Fresno Genealogical Society. Camille Giametti will be here. I think she has a fun program planned for that. October will be our society annual luncheon hosted by Sharon and myself. And if it's not too hot, it'll be outside on the deck underneath redwoods. So then on November the 6th, Thomas MacEntee will return with another program on the use of AI. His program will be entitled AI and Genealogy, Is There Trouble Ahead? Following tonight's program, we will have a short social and refreshment time. Treats are provided tonight by Pat Blanchard. We hope you can stay. And if someone would like to show off their baking skills, there's still okay, there's Costco shopping skill.
No, I got to buy it pre-baked.
There's still a couple of months this year to sign up. And then I also have a sign-up sheet for 2026. So all of that said, our speaker tonight is Madeline Yanoff, the proprietor of Time Travel Genealogy. Brings over 30 years of extensive genealogy experience, specializing primarily in American research. Given that many Americans are descendants of immigrants, she possesses a deep understanding of European genealogy, with primary focus on the Irish, the British, the Slovak, and the Russian ancestry, as well as some German ancestry. She's been instrumental in locating and facilitating reunions between adoptees and their birth parents. Madeline is devoted her time as a weekly volunteer at the Oakland, California Regional Family History Center until April of 23. Since 2011, she's been actively involved as an indexer with Family Search. In 2012, she was elected to the board of directors for Contra Costa County Genealogical Society. Rising up through the ranks, she actually became co-president and then president in May of 21. She presently holds the title of President Emeritus of the Society. By the way, Madeline will be the lead presenter for the annual seminar of the Fresno County Genealogical Society. The seminar will be held at Woodward Park Library, September the 27th, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And for more information, you can go to that society's website. If you need help in finding it, just let me know. Beyond her professional pursuits, Madeline is passionate about travel, relishing opportunities to meet people, hear their family stories, and share her profound love for history and genealogy with anyone eager to learn. So now from her home in Corona, California, will you please join me in welcoming Madeline Yanoff.
Thank you, Dan, for that lovely introduction. How are all of you tonight? As Dan said, my name is Madeline Yanoff, and I'm going to be with you to talk about your family's migration journey. By the end of this talk, I hope you're going to have a clearer picture of why your family moved from one place to another. And we're going to talk about the various different routes that they took, and how we can track some of the records in places that you might not have even thought about. Today, I'm going to talk about the roads and the trails that led to settling of the original 13 colonies and beyond. I'm also going to touch on waterways, canals, and early railroads. So you see how people are moving from the eastern seaboard. For those of you that haven't heard me talk before, just know that I give a lot of information, and if you've already looked at the handout, you'll see that that's true. This is going to be a crash course in the subject. But I think by the time you're finished with it, you're going to be somewhat of an expert. I'm going to stick to the main routes, but keep in mind, I'm not going to be able to cover every single route there is. That's why I suggest that maybe you go to the library and either take out or maybe buy William Dollarhide's book, Map Guide to American Migration Routes. I believe I also have that in your handout. Also, study the resources and the reference section in the handout. That's going to give you a more complete picture. Now, it may seem like I'm spending a lot of time on background information before we get to the actual routes, but believe me, the information is going to be important. It's going to be necessary for you to understand your ancestors' journey and the story behind their move. Now, for those of you whose ancestors took Western trails, like the Mormon or the Oregon Trail, just note that they started in the Midwest, most likely Illinois or Missouri. But your ancestors had to get to the Midwest somehow. And so I think that you will find that helpful too. So what we're going to cover today is why study migration routes. I'm going to give you a lot of information to know about these early trails and your ancestors' preparation. Then we're going to go into the routes themselves, the early colonial routes, the later colonial routes within about 25 years of the Revolutionary War, and then going deeper into the interior. We're also going to talk about water transportation and the different types of water transportation, early railroads. I'm going to give you a lot of sources for finding these records, and I'm going to end up by giving you some tips, things to think about when you're researching. So why study migration? Well, first of all, we need the definition of migration. Migration is simply moving from one place to another. Now, that's different than immigration, which is moving to a new country. Migration is just when people move from one region to another within a country. You're going to find out that your family's migration story is part of our country's history. So to understand why your ancestors left the comfort of their home to travel into the unknown, we need to find out what pushed them away from their comfortable home and what pulled them to new places. Basically, why did they move? You're also going to learn that geography and technology helped or hindered migration. For example, if I lived near a navigable river and I wanted to go to the next settlement over, I'm going to take that river to the next settlement, provided that it's also on the river. I'm going to take the river over walking through the forest because that's going to be the long way. The river will be the shorter way. Mountain ranges also were a big challenge until someone finds a way through them. So you're going to find out that the geography played a role in helping or hindering people, and technology of the time played a role. When you have new travel technology like steamboats or railroads, you're going to find that people moved around a lot more frequently because those items moved them quicker and it was easier. Now, it's important to understand what made it easier or harder for your ancestor to move. Also, people didn't just take up and go nonstop to their destination. Families might stop along the way and stay in a place for many years, sometimes generations, before they get to their final destination. And along the way, children are going to be born, people are going to die. And as I said, they made lots of stops. So expect to find records at different points along the route. And finally, migration is going to answer the questions of what was my ancestor doing here? How did they get here? And why did they move? Now, when we talk about migration, we look for the reasons that people leave their home. One of the main reasons was there was no land available. Now, that either meant there was no physical land available or no fertile land. Overcrowding drove people away. People in the cities would flee to the small towns when they became overcrowded. When the small town became overcrowded, people are going to flee to the wilderness, the frontier. And that's sort of like people in California today, leaving California because they don't want to deal with traffics and the crowds. Some people would leave their home because of religious persecution, like the Mormons. Other people would leave their home because there were no job opportunities. If you were unskilled or uneducated, or if you were the third cobbler in a town of 50, you're not going to have very many job opportunities. So you're going to want to go somewhere else where you can get those opportunities. Many times the death of the patriarch of the family would leave family members scattering to places unknown. Usually the oldest son got the farm, but the other sons may have to go somewhere else because there's no opportunity for them. Many times people would leave because of government policies, either too many laws or too many taxes or too many regulations. That sounds familiar. If the country experienced an economic downfall, then people are going to move to a less costly place. And people also moved because of wars, namely conflicts with their tribe, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. All of these drove people away. Natural disasters and climates also drove people away from their home. Your ancestors had to deal with wildfires. They also had to deal with droughts and floods. And 1816 was called the year without a summer. It was too cold for crops to thrive. And so a lot of farmers went bankrupt because they couldn't grow their crops. That drove them away. And then finally, we get the young man who wants adventure. He's going to leave his town so he can find fame and fortune. Now, just as important as the factors that pushed people away were factors that pulled people to a certain area. You know, why did your ancestors settle in one place rather than another? Well, more fertile land drew a lot of people away. And fertile land in a certain area would mean more opportunities to succeed. You could get bounty land or land from speculators. that was more of a chance to have a fresh start, and you could probably succeed with untouched land, virgin land. A lot of people would move to an area that was like their former home. You have people moving to an area that had a lot of lakes that reminded them of their home, or a lot of hills. Or in my husband's family, they moved to areas around Pittsburgh because there were coal mines there, and there were coal miners in Slovakia. It's no coincidence that you find a lot of Scandinavians in the upper Midwest, because the topography of that land reminded them of home. Freedom to worship. That was a big one, especially for the Mormons. They could go to a place and they weren't going to be persecuted for what they believed in. Chain migration. Most people did not travel alone. They followed family or friends who had already moved away. Sometimes people came as a group, like a church group from the old country, or sometimes they came with family and friends, but they didn't really go alone. Better job opportunities. Whether you were rich or poor, there were opportunities. Poor people could get land and improve their situation, whereas rich people became even wealthier. They became large landowners or speculators. There was less governmental interference on the frontier. You were so far removed from the centers of power, you were essentially forgotten. And on the frontier, it was easier to be ignored by the government. Also, government land policies like the Homestead Act of 1862 opened up land and prompted people to move to get more land. Publicity provided a lot of motive for people to move. They would read about accounts in newspapers or read published books that explorers had written, or read the letters that their family members who have already moved sent back, telling about how wonderful this place is and how you could be whatever you wanted to be in this new land. That would pull them over to that location. And then finally, young men wanting adventure would go to a certain place to find wealth and fame. I'm thinking of people traveling in the 1840s to California because they wanted to mine gold. They wanted adventure. So I need to tell you a few things about early trails and routes. Native trails followed animal trails. Now these trails are going to be the easiest paths. They're generally going to avoid rocky ground and thick underbush. The trails would go the path of least resistance. Now, early American trails are going to follow the native trails. Now, usually these trails are going to be narrow, enough room to walk single file, barely enough room for a horse to walk through, and it's going to be a long time before they're improved for wagons to go through. Your first settlements are going to be either near the coast, like the Plymouth Bay Colony, or near inland rivers, like Jamestown, near the James River. Back then, rivers were the highways, and most trade and travel was done by river. People usually went north to south and east to west. Now, the timeline and the direction of many trails overlapped. People would start out on one trail and then they would switch to another to reach their destination, just like today. Migration happened before the Revolutionary War. When I graduated from college, I worked as a teacher. Back then, American history was taught in concepts. You had the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas, the founding of the colonies. Usually there was a section on the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Then you went to the events leading up to the Revolutionary War, the war itself, and then finally the expansion of the country, beginning with the Louisiana Purchase. Now, this is what I remember teaching. It's not at all true. That way does not encompass the history of the United States. Trails and roads began in the 1600s, long before the Revolutionary War. People didn't wait for Jefferson to become president before they set out for the frontier. Now, I happen to have kept one of the textbooks that I had because the school district was going to be changing textbooks the next year. And when I created this talk, I went back to that textbook to see if what I remembered was correct and what was being taught. And it was. But just know that the way history has been taught in the past left out a lot of information. People were migrating long before the Revolutionary War and long before the Louisiana Purchase. Now, modern roads today, many of the ones out east, are going to follow early inland trails. That's why it's good to get Dollar Hyde's book, because he gives you information on how today's trails trace the old trails. Now, the obstacles preventing people from going into the interior were basically three. The 1763 Royal Proclamation. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 ended the French and Indian War. It also set the westernmost boundary of the colonies. Everything west of the Appalachian was considered Indian land. Now, King George's proclamation in 1763 forbade any colonists from going through and over the Appalachian Mountains. But many people ignored that proclamation. You're over there in London. We're over here in Pennsylvania. How are you going to stop us? But it did have an effect of slowing down the migration. Mountains themselves kept people from going into the interior, especially the Appalachian and the Blue Ridge Mountains. And it wasn't until people were able to find a way through the mountains. Daniel Boone found a way through the southern Appalachian Mountains, through the Cumberland Gap in 1775. Now people could start to go through the mountains. And there was a lack of usable roads, connecting trails and navigable rivers in a lot of the colonies. North Carolina, for example, had a law that said you could connect your town by a road to the nearest river, but you could not connect your town to another road. You could only go to the river. Well, that would be like Tulare not being able to connect to Visalia or Wakena or Tipton. You're isolated. And that kept people from going into the interior for quite a while. Traveling to the frontier was mainly by three modes. You walked, you rode a horse, or you took a wagon. The picture on the left shows Daniel Boone along the Wilderness Trail. And as you can see, they're not a big trail, just enough for people to walk through and ride a horse. The picture on the right, the drawing on the right, shows a Conestoga wagon. Now, this wagon was used exclusively in colonial periods and early American periods and on the Santa Fe Trail. It was not used on the Oregon Trail, even though people call their wagons Conestogas. It wasn't, and you're going to find out in a minute. The Conestoga wagon had broad wheels. The rear wheels were larger than the front. It was covered by a white fabric hood, about 12 feet long, 4 feet 8 inches high. The wagon was basically a convex box, a little under 9 feet long and about 3.5 feet wide. It was pulled by teams of horses or oxen, and it weighed over 6,000 pounds. This wagon with nothing in it is going to be 6,000 pounds. Now, when settlers packed up to go to another area, they would pack up their whole household because they would need it in their new location. So they would carry things like utensils, axes, saws, hammers, and weapons like a rifle or a musket, a pistol or a knife. They'd also pack up food, mainly dry food, enough to keep the family fed for the couple of months that it would take to go on these trails. As you can see in the picture, there's a barrel, a water barrel, attached to the wagon. They would fill the water barrel up when the wagon would go near a stream. They also had to bring sewing needs, cloth and sewing needles to repair the hood of the wagon if it got torn or damaged, and also to repair their clothes. Many people also took a cow because you could get milk and cream from the cow, and the cream could be turned into butter. And if things really got bad, the cow could become dinner. Because you had horses and oxen pulling your wagon, you'd need equipment for the animals. So there would be yokes and harnesses and horseshoes for the horses. Many people also took cooking utensils, pots and pans, ladles, knives, and some people would put a stove in the wagon to carry to their new home. They also took furniture and household goods, chairs, chests, coffee grinders, books, and heirlooms, everything to make their new place a home. But the sad part about this is that if your wagon, which is heavy to begin with, gets stuck in a swamp or the mud or crossing rivers or can't go over a higher elevation, many of these items are going to have to be abandoned along the way. Since the Conestoga wagon was very heavy, and many times the only way to lighten it was to abandon everything that was in it, this is what happened. So now we're actually going to get into the routes. The colonial routes were from 1607 to 1750. I'm not going to read all of these routes that are on the slide because they are in your handout, and we're going to go through them one by one. But just know that these are going to go all the way down from Boston down to Charleston, South Carolina, and all the way to Philadelphia and parts west. Now, we're going to start with the Boston Post Road. Now, a post road is simply a route used to carry mail between two towns. This road connected Boston, Massachusetts to New York. It was created in 1673. because King Charles II wanted his colonies to be able to communicate with one another. The route, it was actually 3 routes. They began at the same point and they ended at the same point. And these 3 routes would go through Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York. It was over 250 miles long, and the round trip took over 4 weeks. But by 1773, they had improved the road enough for stagecoaches to travel on it. And the stagecoach could now make the trip in 1 week. Now, if a stagecoach can go down a road, so can a wagon. And this particular road was a mustering point during the Revolutionary War, a mustering point for soldiers to assemble. Now, as I said, in 1673, King Charles wanted all of his colonies to be able to communicate better. So he dictated that a road be created that would go from Boston all the way down to Charleston. And the first leg of this road, which they called the King's Highway, was the Boston Post Road. Now, as you can see from the map, this mainly goes down along the coast. It was 1,300 miles long, and the trip took 2 months. Now, most of the major cities and the colonies at that time were serviced by this road. You have Boston, you have New York, you have Trenton, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Alexandria, Annapolis, Fredericksburg, Norfolk, Suffolk, New Bern, Wilmington, Georgetown, and Charlestown. And this is where most of the population was at the time, along the coast. So this hit all the major cities along the coast. Well, by 1750, the road had been the road was able to enable stagecoaches or wagons to go to all 13 colonies. So if your ancestor was living in one of these cities and then ends up a little further south, they most likely took the King's Highway. Now, during the Revolutionary War, patriots hated the name of the king or anything to do with the king. So they renamed the road. They called it the Boston Post Road, even though it went down to Charleston. And this road was the colonial version of Interstate I-80. But instead of going north to south, instead of going east to west, it went north to south. Now, the Fall Line Road is the southernmost edge of the Piedmont area, and it's where rivers drop down to the coastal plains. And you're going to have a lot of towns grow up along that. So if you wanted to go from Pennsylvania or Maryland down into the Carolinas, you would take the Fall Line Road. That's the red road on the map. The blue is the King's Highway, and the Fall Line is the red. It ran between the King's Highway on the coast and the upper road, which was further inland, which is the Brown Road. It starts at Fredericksburg, Virginia. It was a little over 1,000 miles long. And it was the route to go into the interior of Virginia, the Carolinas, and even across Georgia. And by 1750, travelers would take this road to go inland. It was a lot easier than going on the Piedmont or Upper Road, which is the Brown Road, because that went over very rocky terrain. Now, this is very important to the Carolinas, because remember that law that said you can only connect to a road to a river? This is an actual road that now starts to connect cities to other cities. So this is the way they got around that first law. The Great Valley Road, which is sometimes known as the Great Wagon Road, basically went from Pennsylvania through the Shenandoah Valley down to Augusta, Georgia, or Knoxville, Tennessee. It was originally a buffalo path, and it was about 800 miles long. The road began in Philadelphia as the Lancaster Pike, which connected Philadelphia to Lancaster, the city of York, and also Gettysburg. From there, it goes down to Winchester, Virginia. Now, at this point, it's still the same road. The Great Valley and the Great Wagon are still the same road. And it's the same until you get to Roanoke. At Roanoke, it splits off. The solid line continues it to Knoxville, Tennessee, and that's called the Great Valley Road. The broken red line is going to go down to Augusta, Georgia. That is the Great Wagon Road. So you may see these names interchanged, but just know they're the same until you get to Roanoke, and then they're going to split off, one going to Knoxville and one going to Augusta. Now the upper road, that branches off the King's Highway at Fredericksburg. That's the brown line. And again, this is another wagon route that's important for migrating into North Carolina. And it had become a very important route by 1750. Excuse me. Now, this road was mainly used for troop movements during the Revolutionary War, especially for the battles of King Mountain and Cowpens. It's also known as the Piedmont Road. So if you come across the name Piedmont Road in your research, you're going to know that it's the upper road. And as you can see, it is much further inland than the fall line. But it is a road that enables wagons to go down, and that means it enables people to move. The Pioneers Road is a very short road. It's about 215 miles, and it stays within Virginia. But it's important because it connects Alexandria, Virginia to Winchester. That opens in 1746, and it was made so you could have a wagon train from Alexandria to Winchester. Now, why is Winchester important? It's important because it's the westernmost settlement in Virginia. You leave Winchester and you are in the wilderness. It intersects the Great Valley Road that we just talked about at Winchester. And this was a major reason why people would leave the Tidewater area, Jamestown, Williamsburg, Norfolk, and they would be able to move west and south by just taking that little road to get to Winchester. The Pennsylvania Road is not a single road. Well, it didn't start out to be a single road. It was the name of a collection of roads, which include the Forbes Road. We're going to get to that in a minute. And it was completed in 1792 between Philadelphia and Lancaster. It was called the Lancaster Pike. Well, the Pennsylvania Assembly was so proud of themselves for creating this nice road, they decided to extend it all the way to Pittsburgh, following the Forbes Road. It's at this point that it's called the Pennsylvania Road. This, excuse me, this road is the major migration route to Western Pennsylvania. You're getting away from Philadelphia, and now you're going to be ending up in Pittsburgh. Now we go to the later colonial roads, the roads created within 25 years of the Revolution. Again, I'm not going to read all of these. These are on your handout, and we're going to go through them. But just know that it encompasses going west in Pennsylvania. It's going to go to Kentucky and north in New York. Braddock's Road and Forbes Road were military roads created during the French and Indian War. Braddock's Road, which is the dotted line, went from Fort Cumberland, Maryland, to Fort Duquesne, which is now Pittsburgh. And the Forbes Road went from Harrisburg, it's a solid line, also to Pittsburgh. In 1755, General Braddock was given a mission to remove the French from British territory. The French were held up at Fort Duquesne. Now, on his staff was a young officer by the name of George Washington. And along with 600 men, Braddock and Washington moved towards Fort Duquesne. Now, Fort Duquesne was important because it controlled the forks of the Ohio River, which led to the Mississippi Valley. So Braddock and his army built the first wagon-sized road through the Appalachian Mountains. And the road was 12 feet wide, enough to enable supply wagons to get through. Well, unfortunately, disaster strikes. Braddock is killed, and the British do not manage to kick the French out. 3 years later, General Forbes is given the same task: get the French out of Fort Duquesne. And he decides to build a road as an alternative to Braddock's Road. On his staff is a young officer by the name of George Washington. Now, Washington argues that we don't need a new road. We can use Braddock's Road. It's perfectly fine. But his advice is ignored, and they build the road. By the time the French get to Fort Duquesne, by the time the British get to Fort Duquesne, the French had already abandoned it. Now, over time, Braddock's Road becomes unusable. It gets so bad that people decide they'd rather stick to horse trails or take Forbes Road instead. And that's why you ended up having more and more people going on Forbes Road, even though it was a longer road than Braddock's was. The important we take from this is it advanced Western migration, both from Maryland and Pennsylvania to Western Pennsylvania. Now, Kentucky, which is what they called Kentucky before the Revolutionary War, was unreachable until Daniel Boone reaches it in 1769. But there's no road to get into it until the Transylvania Company hires him to lay out a road through the Cumberland Mountains, and he did. It's called the Cumberland Gap. And he found that way through the mountains in 1775. The same year, he establishes Boonesboro, which is a little south of Lexington. Now, this is going to connect to the Great Valley Road. And now people are going to be able to go from Kentucky to the Carolinas and vice versa. It's named the Wilderness Road in 1796 when wagons are able to travel on it. The Boston Post Road wasn't the only post road in the colonies. There was one that was created to connect New York City to Albany. And because it went from New York City, and New York City was on the King's Highway, it connected to the King's Highway. So now you had a way for people in Albany to go down to the Carolinas. After 1763, Ben Franklin ordered mileposts to be added every mile on the trail and also other post roads. And that was because this way they could figure out how far the mail went, how many mileposts you would pass by, because postage costs were based on the distance a letter went. 1785 stagecoach service is established between New York City and Albany. So that makes it easier to travel. And once the Erie Canal is opened in 1825, it is an easy way for people in New York City to reach the Erie Canal. They just take the post road to Albany and they can catch the Erie Canal at Albany. In 1850, train tracks reach Albany. So now it's very easy for people to get to Albany. And over time, the post road is used less and less. The Mohawk or Iroquois Trail was the most northerly route through the Appalachians. It ran from Albany all the way to Lake Ontario. After the Revolutionary War, loyalists who wanted to go to Canada to leave the United States would head up north on the King's Highway until they get to New York, then go to Albany and take this trail to Lake Ontario, after which you cross the lake and you are now in Canada. If you follow the blue squiggly line on this slide, that blue squiggly line is the Erie Canal. You'll find out that the Erie Canal pretty much traced the path. It traced the trail all the way to Buffalo. So now we are going to go into the interior. Again, all of these are in your handout. This is going to push you further into Kentucky and Tennessee. We're going to find that the country actually created a national road, and we're going to also look at some very small roads around Chicago. In 1796, Congress authorized Ebenezer Zane to build a road from Wheeling, at the time it was Virginia, to Maysville, Kentucky. And he had to do it before January 1st, 1797. So he had a little less than a year to build this. The road is the dotted line on the slide. Well, he was required to build 3 ferries that crossed 3 rivers when the path opened. Originally, it was a narrow path, but in 1804, a 20-foot road was built over the route. So now wagons could travel over it. But it wasn't the best road in the world, because when men chopped down the trees to clear the path, they were allowed to leave the tree stumps in the road as long as the tree stumps were not over a foot high, because the thinking was the wagons would be high enough to pass over it. Well, spoiler alert, it didn't always work that way. Even so, Zane's Trace was the main land route in early Ohio. You could go from Maysville, and it was also called Limestone. You could take a boat and go all the way to Cincinnati. Now, the Nashville Road was a military road built in 1788. The militia built a road to connect Knoxville in eastern Tennessee to Nashville in central Tennessee. It was the main east-west overland route in Tennessee. It was only 180 miles long. But it was important because once you got to Nashville in 1796, there was an extension that went from Nashville to Lexington, Kentucky. And from Lexington, you would have other roads that would connect you to Zane's Trace. So you can see how this road sort of helped link up what's starting to become a big migration network. The National Road, also known as the Cumberland Road, was one of two federally funded roads. Now, it resulted from the act that admitted Ohio into the Union because the act called for money to be put aside to build a national road, and construction began in 1811. And Congress would appropriate money for it until 1838. Well, in the 1830s, Congress got tired of the responsibility for maintenance, and so they turned that over to the individual states that this road went through. And by 1838, the road had reached Vandalia, Illinois. Excuse me. Now, in 1840, Congress decided not to furnish any more money for this road because railroads were starting to prove to be faster and more efficient. So they were turning their interest towards the railroads. But the only problem was, in 1820, money had been appropriated to extend the road to St. Louis. And the road stops in 1838 in Illinois. The road was supposed to run through all of the state capitals on the way to St. Louis. Well, Missouri had to finish the road by himself, even though money had been appropriated for it. So ultimately, an extension stretched from Vandalia, Illinois to St. Louis and then Jefferson City, Missouri. Most of the people that went on the national road were from Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and Ohio. This is how you got to Indiana and Illinois. Now, there were two small roads that were connected to Chicago. One connected Detroit on Lake Erie to Chicago on Lake Michigan. You could ship your goods there. Now, you could also go the route of the Great Lakes, go from Lake Erie to Lake Michigan, but the Great Lakes, especially Lake Michigan, are very rough water. In fact, Lake Michigan has been compared to open ocean. So it was a little easier to just create a road to go from Detroit to Chicago. Now, there was another road from Chicago. This led to Galena, Illinois. If you've ever been to Galena, it is a very, very beautiful 1800s town with lots of restaurants and antique shops and art galleries. But the thing that drew people to Galena back then was that it was on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. Galena connected to the Mississippi River. This way, people and goods from Chicago could go to Galena and then go down the Mississippi to New Orleans. We're going to go into the Southwest now. I called it the Old Southwest because we think of the Southwest as Arizona, New Mexico, and so on. And historically, the Southwest was any land that was south and west of the original 13 colonies. So this is the Old Southwest. Mainly, we're going to go through Tennessee, down to Alabama, and then New Orleans. The Natchez Trace was used by flatboatmen returning from Natchez. You'd take your flatboat and you would go down the river to Natchez and unload your boat, get paid for your goods, and travel on this narrow overland route all the way, up through Mississippi and then to Nashville and then all the way up to Lexington, up to Maysville. It was 440 miles long, and it went through Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. It was the only reliable road south from Kentucky. But it had a very bad reputation, and it was known as the Devil's Backbone. And the reason it was known as the Devil's Backbone was that all of these flatboat men, who now are a little wealthier because they've sold their goods, are going up this route, and they're set upon by thieves and murderers. Many men were robbed and lost their lives on the Natchez Trace. This eventually was ended by the steamboat. People stopped going on it because they could now use the steamboat instead. But it was a very important route connecting Natchez all the way up to Maysville. The federal route, which is also called the Federal Horse Path, was that second federal funded road. Remember, I told you there were two. There's the National Road, and now this is the second one. And it came about in 1806 because President Jefferson got fed up that it would take 4 weeks for a letter to go from New Orleans to Washington, D.C. So he pressures Congress to allow money to build a road so mail can be delivered more quickly. It went through wetlands and mainly the Creek Nation land. And the U.S. government at the time pressures the Creeks to allow travelers through it. It connects to the Fall Line and also the upper roads. So now there's a way to get down to New Orleans. Extensions from this road are going to lead to migration to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and even to Texas. There were 2 roads that led to New Orleans that I want to briefly mention. One is Jackson's Military Road. It connected Nashville to New Orleans. And at Tupelo, it's going to split off from the Natchez Trace. It's going to go to Madisonville, and then a little connector is going to end up in New Orleans. Now, there was also another route from Natchez to New Orleans. I tried to find a historical map for that, but in all the years since I created this, I have not been able to, so you're going to have to just see the modern day version of Natchez to New Orleans Trail. And Natchez is the upper circle on the right. And as you can see, if you follow the line, it'll end up in New Orleans. Now, the Natchez New Orleans Trail was important because Natchez was an important southern hub, and it helped connect directly to New Orleans. Now that we've covered all the roads and trails, we're going to briefly talk about rivers, which are the original highways for your ancestors. In the beginning, early settlers relied heavily on rivers for travel because they were the first major highways. Most people are going to use a mixture of rivers and overland routes to migrate. In the beginning, people would use dugouts or simple canoes to travel. Then they moved on to small sloops that would navigate coastal rivers. As people moved further inland, they would build rafts to go down larger rivers. If you've ever seen the movie How the West Was Won, there's a scene in the beginning where a family is floating down a river. It's supposed to be a river somewhere around Pittsburgh, on a very big raft, stacked high with all their belongings. And that's what it really looked like. Now, eventually rafts are going to give way to flatboats, which are sturdier and held more. And then flatboats are later going to be replaced by steamboats. A flatboat is a rectangular flat bottom boat with square ends. Now, it can be any size because it displaced water, so it's floating in the water as opposed to a raft which floats on the water. It is a one-way vessel which is going to be dismantled for lumber when it reaches its destination. And they are powered by men with poles and the current, as you can see in the picture. Now, a steamboat is a boat primarily pushed by steam to turn a paddle wheel. The first American steamboat, the Clermont, is built in 1807 by Robert Fulton, and it sailed 150 miles between New York City and Albany in 32 hours. Now, you're going to find steamboats mainly on the Ohio and Mississippi River. There were on other rivers, but it was mainly on these two. Now, a lot of steamboat companies kept passenger lists and crew lists, but not all of them have survived. So if you think your ancestor was on a steamboat, check archival collections at large public or university libraries, historical societies, and museums. Also look into the libraries and historical societies in river towns like St. Louis or Cincinnati, because they might have steamboat records that you're not going to be able to find anyplace else. Now let's talk about canals. The first and probably the most famous one was the Erie Canal. It was finished in 1825, and it was a game changer. It was built and paid for by the state of New York, and it gave farmers access to new markets and brought lots and lots of new settlers west. Now, the Erie Canal became the #1 migration route for people that wanted to go to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Now, the canals built in Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and Indiana are going to carry the majority of people traveling by canal. But just about every northeastern state and some Midwest states had a canal or two. What I have mentioned on this slide are 4 important canals that helped people move westward. The Erie Canal connected the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie. The Ohio Erie Canal connected Lake Erie to the Ohio River. The Louisville and Portland Canal connected the Ohio River at Louisville. Well, it connected to itself because what it did is it bypassed a 2-mile waterfall section. So you had 2 miles of just constant waterfalls, and this bypassed it so people could safely go down the Ohio River. And then you have the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which connected Chicago on Lake Michigan, one of the Great Lakes, to the Mississippi River. So now you don't have to go to Galena. You can go straight to the Mississippi River. And just to put everything in perspective, what would take 4 weeks in 1800 now would just take 2 weeks in 1830, thanks to the canals. So it cut travel time in half. And here is a map that shows where these canals that I just spoke about are. You have the Erie Canal, the upper right, connecting to Lake Erie. Then you have the Ohio and Erie Canal connecting to the Ohio River. The Louisville and Portland Canal, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a very small little dark line that's on the Ohio River, the blue squiggly line, and that's just the bypass for the waterfalls. And then you have the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which connects Chicago to the Illinois River, which then flows into the Mississippi. The first U.S. railroad was built when the Erie Canal was finished. The Baltimore and Ohio began operation in 1830, which is 5 years after the Erie Canal was opened. It was built as competition to the Erie Canal. Now, early railroads used to haul freight until someone got the brilliant idea, let's haul people too. And so they started hauling people and freight. But in the very early days, while there were many railroad companies, a lot of them could not connect to one another because everyone had a different gauge track. And your train could only go on a certain gauge track and couldn't go on another one. And it wasn't until they standardized things that you were able to go a long distance. Of the first train's locomotive was named Tom Thumb, and here is a replica of the Tom Thumb. And discussions about a transcontinental railroad began in the 1830s. But it's not until 1862, the middle of the Civil War, that Congress starts authorizing the construction of a line, and it's not until 1869 that the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. So now you know what routes to look for. We're going to talk about the sources you're going to find the information in. Now, some are going to be online, some might be buried in a courthouse or a university library, but they're all worth checking out. Maps and atlases can show you rivers and canals and trails your ancestor might have tried. The three that I would suggest looking into are the David Rumsey historical maps, and I think that information is on your handout. Perry Castaneda library map collection, and the Library of Congress. Census records are going to give you information, especially the 1850 and 1880 censuses. These are going to include the birthplace of children, which are going to help you track the migration of the family. Mortality schedules, which are the census for people that have died within a year of the 1850, 1860, 1870, and 1880 censuses, are going to list where they were born, and also state censuses. Sometimes compiled stories might have your ancestor mentioned in them. County and town archives are going to have early tax records or land deeds or court records that may mention your ancestor. County histories often lists the first families or the first settlers, and they give you general information about the area that your ancestor moved to. Court records. Well, your ancestor might have been involved in a lawsuit, a land dispute, heaven forbid, a criminal case, or just served as a witness for official documents. Remember, people didn't go from point to point nonstop. They would go to a place, settle there for a while, and then eventually move on. but while they were there, they might have been involved in a legal matter. Church records many times are going to list where the original members came from, or church rosters. Diaries and journals from your ancestors or other travelers are going to give you clues about the routes. Government records like military pensions and naturalization papers and land grants can tell you a lot. Look for land records like grants or bounty lands or transfer of deeds in the county records. Or you can also find them in the Bureau of Land Management. Check public libraries, university libraries, and private libraries, like the Newberry Library in Chicago. And don't also forget to check WorldCat, because that way you can search many libraries at once to see if they have the record you're looking for. Many times newspapers would list new arrivals in town. Also, they're going to have the obituaries of early settlers. Land sale notices are going to be listed in newspapers. And also there's going to be articles on roads opening or closing, canals, or maybe new government policies. Ancestry, Cindy's List, Family Search, both the catalog and the wiki, and Internet Archive are all going to have collections and sources. Pension records. You're going to look for those at the National Archives, but they're going to tell you where someone may have been born or where they originally came from. You can also find them and bounty land information on Fold 3 and MyHeritage. Probate records might tell you if your ancestor had land in multiple places. State archives. If your ancestor was in a territory before it became a state, the records will be in that state archives. Tax records sometimes will tell when a person left the county and where they moved to. That's going to help you in figuring out migration too. University holdings, and that's going to include manuscripts, map collections, original diaries, and local histories. All of these in manuscript collections. And don't forget the vital records, birth, marriage, and death. Track each child where they were born all the way back to the parents to see the family's journey. Now here's a few tips. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's a few tips to keep in mind when you're researching. Your ancestor had to pass through many counties along the way on their trip. Check the county histories of the counties along the route. Look for nearby canals, waterways, trails, roads, and railroads. They're not mutually exclusive. Many people would take a road and a river. Pennsylvania had a lot of cases where they would have a railroad connected to a canal. People searched for settlements that were ethnically similar to them, something that reminded them of the topography of their home back in the old country. And people would gravitate towards people of the same ethnic group. My grandmother was born in a German farming community in central Illinois. Everything was German. The founding families were German. All of the people that moved there were German. When she went to school, she was bilingual because she was being taught in German and English. So people would move towards an area where there were people like them. Many times, if a man marries within a few years of settling down, it's to a girl back home. He doesn't have time to look for a woman, and there might not be that many women where he is. He married somebody back home because maybe he knew the family or he knew the girl. So check marriage records for clues to people's origins. Look for place names that suggest the area of a settler's origin. Now that's going to be in the names of towns, creeks, settlements, and churches. As I pointed out before, census records may point to someone's origins. So you want to look at the 1850 and 1880 censuses, the mortality schedules from 1850 through 1880, and state censuses. Remember, roads would go the path of least resistance, and people would travel on a road near them and then eventually switch to others. Check the date a road opens, because the odds are there's going to be very few people living in an area before the road to get there opens up. You're going to have to know the push and pull factors influencing your ancestor. Most push and pull factors were the same no matter where you lived, but there might be something different about your ancestors. The Mormons were persecuted, so they kept on moving west, but that might not have happened to somebody that was a Catholic. So learn the push and pull factors. Know that delinquent tax records often offered a clue when someone left an area. The tax enumerator would say, move to Grant County. That's a place to start looking. If your ancestor was in New England, those records are mainly going to be kept in town archives, not necessarily in county archives. Determine where the frontier was. It was very fluid and it constantly moved west. So you can't just say they lived near the frontier, because the frontier might be 100 miles west. Look for records in colonial or territorial sources. If a foreign government or other state owns the land, look for records in that archives, in the state's archives. Now, some original bounty land grant awardees sold their bounties to speculators or third parties. So if you find out your ancestor has bounty land and you can't find any proof that he was ever in the military and served between the Revolutionary War and 1855, he might have bought it. Maybe the original owner got too old or sick or didn't want to move, and so he needed money, and so he sold his bounty land to someone. That might be a pull factor in migration. Sometimes the previous residence of a party is listed in a record. I've seen records where they've said so-and-so was late of York County, Pennsylvania. Now we think of the word late as describing the deceased, but that wasn't necessarily true in history. It also meant that was the last place you lived. So you might get clues in records like that. And then finally, migration was not necessarily a long distance. Some people just may have moved to the next county over. So if you have any questions, or if you find a link in the handout that's broken, please don't hesitate to email me. I really want to know that. And if you're curious about a trail or a migration route that I didn't mention, also email me, because I couldn't include everything here, but I might have the information you're looking for. And with that, I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Questions? I think she did a very clean job. Thank you very much, Madeline.
Well, you're very welcome.
We will look forward to part 2, and that's in January. Next year.
Yeah, that's coming to California. I think you may know that. Now, I'm the original immigrant to California in my family.
All right. Thank you again.